Welcome to the Developers Who Test podcast, a podcast for developers who embrace test automation so they can ship better quality software faster and have more fun doing it. I'm your host, Chris Harbert, and I'm here today with James Sansbury. James has a background in software development and worked his way up into being a development manager and is presently the director of product for Tugboat QA, a platform that makes it easy to deploy full stack testing and review environments. Today's episode of the Developers Who Test podcast is brought to you by Testery.com. Whether you're a developer who has just a handful of tests or even thousands, then your tests deserve to be running on the fastest and most reliable platform for open source testing. With AI-driven insights and analytics, unparalleled parallelism, and awesome integrations, Testery enables you to get more from your tests. Check us out today at Testery.com. Welcome to the Developers Who Test podcast, James.
Thank you. Excited to be here.
Yeah, so I guess I'd like to start. You work for a company that's very much in the QA tool space, and I'm interested, how did you wind up working there and how did your company come about?
Yeah, this is a fun story. So I actually graduated with a degree in music. And so how I ended up where I am right now is a mystery even to me, but it's a circuitous route for sure. Long story short, after graduating college, I tried to start a record label, and from that was trying to learn how to build websites for the bands that I was working with, and stumbled my way into, this was, maybe around 2005, 2006, stumbled my way onto, the whole, even just concept of content management systems back then, which was all new to me. My prior experience with building websites was GeoCities, which way back in the early days of the internet was like one of the first, like, here, we'll just host your website. And at that point, you were just like writing raw HTML, all the HTML tags were uppercase. Everything was tables. It was a fun time. And then stumbled onto a content management system called Drupal, and had no programming background really, but ran into some issues and just started, like, since it was open source, just jumped into the code itself and was like, I think I could actually do this. Like, I was reading PHP code and it kind of made sense to me. And fast forward several years, the record label didn't do so well, but the website development side of things actually did pretty well. So I was getting better and better at actually, like, building websites. And then eventually I was like, well, maybe I should just, go out and see if I can get a job doing this. So, completely self-taught, no really programming background whatsoever. But then ended up getting hired by a small graphic design shop. And then that graphic design shop got acquired by a company called Lullabot, which is very big in the Drupal space. And at that point was doing a lot of training and stuff like that. So I was hired as a trainer for Drupal developers, and then became a Drupal developer myself, like at Lullabot, just building websites. And one of my first experiences with actually getting into automated testing, since I had, was pretty scrappy in terms of my background, and just slowly, like, kind of peeling the layers off of that scrappiness, and becoming, I guess, a little bit more refined and more enterprise ready, so to speak. One of my first big gigs at Lullabot was for MarthaStewart.com. And one of the things that we needed to do for them, they were migrating from Vignette over to Drupal. And the actual, like, editorial interface was all Drupal. And then we needed to, like, migrate over all of the front-facing user experience. So marthastewart.com actually had like, you as a consumer could go there and sign in and save your recipes that you liked, or other content that you liked, and have your notes and stuff in there. And so we needed to migrate all that data over. And so we actually built a completely separate Drupal application for just that, so that the two interfaces were completely separate. And in building that, we're going for 100% test coverage as we're building this. And that was my first, like, let's just from the beginning do this. And so,
whose idea was that? Did that come from the top down, the bottom up?
It did not come from the top down. It was me and a colleague of mine were really wanted to do it that way, and we didn't work. We were working for Lullabot, and Lullabot was a vendor of Martha Stewart at that time. And but we had a lot of support and trust from the leadership at Martha Stewart, which was great. And so they were like, yeah, let's do this. I think that was around the time that I, first started getting exposed to concepts around like test-driven development and behavioral-driven development and stuff like that. And so we really we're striving to do, anytime we had feature requests that came down, or user stories that came down, from the development or the product design and development team, we would just start writing the tests first. And it was challenging. I'll be honest, it was really challenging at times. A lot of times it just worked, and then other times it didn't work. So I said long story short, but this is long story long, I guess. That was probably my first like real experience as a developer, where I was like, okay, I can kind of see, like, I had this ideal going into it in my mind to like, yeah, we can do this 100% test coverage. And then getting actually into it and realizing like, there are some real challenges to working this way. And then also, this may segue into a question I have for you. Long term, I don't think it was actually a success. Because as soon as we rolled off the project and it got inherited by other developers who had a little bit of a different mindset, once the tests, one test starts to fail, right? And whoever's working on the project at that point doesn't really know, how do I fix this test, right? And so they just they just mute that test or whatever. They just shut it off. And then that just kind of starts like a snowball effect of like tests. Once tests start becoming flaky, then there's this mindset of like, well, are these tests actually even working to begin with? Or like, what value do we have from these? And it starts to kind of erode the trust in the actual testing system, to the point where it's like, these tests are actually more of a detriment than they are helping the organization. And I'm kind of curious for you, like, I'm sure you've seen that a ton. Like, have you seen successful ways to handle that on big projects like that?
Yeah, absolutely. What I've seen is testing really has to be a culture, and it has to be something that you train your team on if they're not trained on it, and it has to be something that your leadership is in support of and demanding in order to be successful. And I think part of why that happens is, the people who've written the tests, people who do test-driven development, almost universally appreciate testing, understand why it's there, and realize they're creating better applications because the tests were there while they were writing the code, and there to help prevent issues. But when you're someone who hasn't done that before, it does feel slower. Like it feels like, oh, I can write something, and if I'm only writing the code, I can write it twice as fast as I can if I'm writing the code in the tests. So this time around, for whatever reason, I'm just gonna write only the code. But what you're effectively doing is you're putting untested code into the repository that you're then handing off to other developers.
Mm-hmm.
So this is one of those situations where it takes personal responsibility from everyone on the team, or it takes a system with integrity built in where you just are required to write the tests and required to meet code coverage thresholds, or you can't even merge.
Mm-hmm.
One of those things has to happen in order to make sure that everybody's tests are there. And you're absolutely right that, if people don't stay on top of the tests over time, they do start to become flaky. They
Mm-hmm.
do start to get muted. And, uh, it's a real shame because I think that happens mostly due to a lack of appreciation and understanding for why the test is really there. So,
Mm-hmm.
uh, one example is the most important reason to write a test is just to think through all of the scenarios while you're writing the code.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, so the user is going to ask you for a feature, and you're going to write that up as a user story. And the user story typically has acceptance criteria.
Mm-hmm.
And the acceptance criteria could be things like, when I log in as an admin, then I'm taken to the admin dashboard. When I log in as a regular user, I'm taken to the accounts page. Typical requirements.
Mm-hmm.
When you turn those into test cases and you're doing test driven development, it makes it really obvious. Uh, okay, well, what if I log in as someone who's not not a standard user, not an admin, but we have this other role? Maybe
Mm-hmm.
it's like a super admin or something. Well, what page are they supposed to go to? So your test is like helping to elaborate the requirements. And if you're not writing the test to begin with, it's way too easy to just go through and write for the feature that was asked for without thinking through of all the implications throughout the entire application or
Mm-hmm.
other scenarios that weren't asked for.
Yeah, it sounds like what you're
So,
saying is like, and I think I fell into this somewhat when I first started writing tests. Was like when I would start to write a test, I would just write, like, let me assert that when an admin logs in, they see what they're supposed to see. I'm done now. I wrote the test, right? And it sounds like what you're saying is like you kind of need to switch the paradigm around and say like, not only am I asserting what is supposed to happen, but I also need to think about what's not supposed to happen.
mhm.
In that case,
Yeah.
as a guest user, if I log in, I should not see this, or this, that sort of
Yeah.
stuff. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Like with the test, you're creating an executable version of the requirements that were
Mm-hmm.
given to you.
Mm-hmm.
And so that test becomes not just your documentation for what the requirements in a very
Mm-hmm.
concrete way ended up being, it also becomes an executable method that you can run to make sure that the code is actually doing what the requirements were understood to be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so it plays a hugely important role in figuring out what the requirements are to a level of detail that they can actually be implemented in terms of
Oh
code.
yeah.
But the biggest reason I think to have tests is, if you've ever worked on a team that has 50% code coverage or 60% code coverage,
Mm-hmm.
you can definitely feel the difference on that team compared to one that has 80 or to 90% code coverage.
Mm.
Because the developers on the 50% or less code coverage team, they tend to be afraid to make big changes.
Right.
Sometimes they're even afraid to make little changes.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you're a developer in that situation, you almost have to, well, you could just be doing a crappy job and pushing untested code and breaking
Mm-hmm.
things. Or you're doing a good job and you're in this like state of paranoia where it's like, okay, well, I changed this. Let me search everywhere in the code where I think this is used. Let me think about it. Gosh, I don't know if I want to touch that file. I don't understand that file. And the
Mm-hmm.
tests, having good test coverage frees you up from that mindset. So that's like really huge.
Yeah.
Um, having tests also protects you from less experienced people on the team. So, and less experienced doesn't always mean less experienced software developer. It could mean, they're an ex-Googler who's been doing development for 15 years, but it's day one at the new company and they're not
Right.
familiar with all the business rules. They're still inexperienced in that code base, right?
Yeah, that makes
And
sense.
having the tests is a huge way of protecting that.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the biggest value here is like the teams that have lower test coverage also spend more of their time working on bugs. And if you
Mm-hmm.
think about it, a team that spends half their time on bugs versus new functionality is effectively twice as large as a team that spends almost all of their time on new functionality. And
Hmm.
so if I went to management and said, hey, we've got this practice we could be doing where if we're doing it right, it would be almost as if we had twice as many developers on our team for the same salaries. Uh,
Hmm.
they would say, well, why aren't you doing that? It seems like
Yeah.
malpractice not to be doing that. And
Uh-huh.
that's effectively the situation. I think we're just not explaining it well enough to management that can really be the true impact of having good solid tests in place.
Yeah. And it takes some time to get there though, right? Like if someone's in an organization where testing is not part of the culture and suddenly management has buy-in and
Mhm.
all of the, you know, leadership and development on the development side as well is like, let's do this. Um, it's going to take some time, right, to get to and maybe this is a good question for you. Like, how would you even embark on that project? Would you just like say, okay, we're going to dedicate 100% or 75% of our development resources towards getting test coverage for all the stuff we currently have? Or what sort of strategy would you take to starting to make that shift from
Yeah.
like, okay, let's say we've got 30% test coverage, but we want to really get to that 80% minimum test coverage level?
Yeah. So I may have used this metaphor already on this podcast, but I'll probably use it now and use it a lot more times.
Mm-hmm.
We need to stop thinking that testing is optional when we're writing code.
Mm-hmm.
Testing is very much like the ruler that we use to measure whether or not the thing that we've built is the right size.
Mm-hmm.
And you wouldn't go into a construction site as a manager and say, I want you all to build me the building and I want you to build it right. But I
Mm-hmm.
don't want you to use any rulers. I don't want you to use any levels. I don't
Right.
want you to use any squares because I feel like it would just be faster if you just cut the boards without measuring them so
Mm-hmm.
many times and just nailed them together. We
Mm-hmm.
could get a pretty good house going pretty quickly that way, right?
Yeah.
That manager would get, if they did that, they would get thrown off the site because people know that to build a good house, you need to measure things as you're building it. You don't
Mm-hmm.
just measure the house when it's done, you measure all of the components as you're putting them into the house.
Mm-hmm.
And building software is very much the same way. Someday, somebody's going to come along, whether it's a future homeowner or another contractor, and they're going to have to build something on top of that thing that you've built.
Mm-hmm.
And their job is going to be so much harder if you didn't build it the right size, you didn't make it level, you didn't make it square. And
Mm-hmm.
so those things are important in construction, just like they're important in software development.
Yeah.
So what that
Absolutely.
means as a developer who tests is if a manager asks me, how long does this take? It's my responsibility to say, how long does it take to do the job the right way, which
Mm-hmm.
includes putting those tests in. And
Yeah.
I think anytime we don't do that, we're really cheating our future selves and
Mm-hmm.
ending up with a poorer quality result, but also making our future selves go slower.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Mhm.
Where? How do you? I really like that metaphor, and one of the things that it strikes me about it is that one big difference I think between building a house and building some sort of application is that the application feels like we don't actually know fully what we're building sometimes when we're starting. We're just kind of like, well, let's build this thing and then see how that works and try to fit it with this other thing. And it's kind of like an evolving, moving target a little bit as it's being built, versus a house. Usually there's at least like the grand plan, and like maybe when we get into like choosing the cabinet colors and stuff like that, then things can switch. But for the most part, before anyone puts a shovel into the dirt, we know what's going to happen. We know what it's supposed to look like in the end. And sometimes when we're starting software projects, we don't exactly know. We know what we want to achieve, but we don't exactly know the shape it's going to take to get there. And how does that affect the sorts of tests that you choose to write and how you write them in those early phases?
Yeah, so I'm willing to continue with the construction metaphor here. So I did some volunteering for like Habitat for Humanity, and before we would put in a door, for example, we would measure the doorway. We knew what it was supposed to be, but if you weren't the crew that put in the door, you go ahead and measure it before you put the door in, and every now and then you find out, more often than not, that maybe things are a quarter of an inch too small on the bottom or a quarter of an inch too small on the top, and so you've got to trim down that door before you put it in, or adjust the trim and things like that, right? So having the test is also a way of helping you make sure that the thing works the way that you thought it was supposed to work. And that's so important when you're in an environment where things are constantly changing. So if you can have a component that you can pull in and with certainty that component's going to work when you pull it in or when you take it out, when you want to replace it with something else, the tests help give you some guidance there. But you did bring up an interesting point, like how do you know what kind of testing to do when, right? I think that's kind of where having a bit of an evolving model can be helpful. So, which areas of the application are stable, which areas aren't stable, what are the different technologies that are involved, how long do we expect this thing to live? That can help inform how much you want to invest in testing. But I can also say this, when I started Testery, the very first commit into the repository was an automated test.
Let's hope.
It was an integration test. Nice. User can authenticate. And I can't imagine building an API without building the test first, because that's just the easiest way to run an API, right? And it's the easiest way to make sure that your API continues to work as you're making changes rapidly under the hood to everything else. So there certainly are some tests that make sense to have from day one, always kept up to date, always made sure that they're green. I would say API level integration tests absolutely fall into that category, right? And particularly in modern applications where it's typically a single page JavaScript application, TypeScript, that's all interacting with that API. If the API is well tested, that's going to significantly reduce the odds of something that is hard to fix happening in production. So that's absolutely worth doing. Now, when it comes to like end-to-end tests, that's where the investment is higher and still absolutely worth doing. But you might want to be a little more pragmatic about when to do it. So, if you're a startup and you're building a new feature and you're not even sure anybody's going to use that feature, have your unit and integration tests. But get the feature out there as quickly as you can so you can get feedback from the customers on if it's something that you want to keep or not. That's a decision you can make, right? To postpone the end-to-end test for that. But if you do postpone the end-to-end tests, it's really hard to convince people to come back later and put them in. And they don't remember how everything works when they do that. So it's still, it's a judgment call. It's how much do you think you're really going to have that feature around? And I can guarantee you, if you ship the feature and customers do like it, and you still don't have those end-to-end tests, that at some point that's going to bite you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that brings up an interesting thought for me, because I like the idea of that in terms of new features that are coming into an existing project, and sort of having a heuristic to determine what sort of tests are right and how in depth they should be for a given feature, and then maybe on the other end of the spectrum. So on that side of the spectrum, you're starting with those unit tests, you're starting with the integration tests, and maybe you're holding off on the end-to-end tests, is what I hear you saying. And then I could see a situation where if I'm coming in inheriting a project that's like fully baked, and there's been no testing culture in building it, would you say that actually starting with the end-to-end tests would be like the best place to start? Like this project's already running and it's working, and I don't really understand the inner workings of it, but I want to get testing rolling on it. Would you kind of flip that recipe where maybe we start with the end-to-end tests and just like describe how it works from a user point?
Yeah. I think that's the most natural place for people to start. So when I come into a project that all they're doing is manual testing, if you're lucky, they'll have those manual test cases documented somewhere. They don't always.
Yeah.
It might just be Word documents and Excel files. So I've come into some places where it's like, here's the Excel file of our regression suite, and here's the steps, and you update the Excel file as you're going. If you're a little bit luckier, you have a test case management system that makes it easier to kick off test runs and assign them to people. Those types of tests very naturally roll into end-to-end tests.
Right.
And so you can very quickly get those in place, and it doesn't need to be the same team that's doing the manual testing. It doesn't need to be the same team that's the developers. You can come into virtually any application and get some good end-to-end tests in place that'll, if not fully replace, at least take a lot of the regression testing off the plate for the manual testing team. Very much worth doing, and a great place to start. But while you're doing that, it can also be helpful to say, okay, instead of creating 15 end-to-end tests for this one feature, how can I create 2 end-to-end tests? Like maybe one happy path test, one sad path test that really tests from a user perspective what's going on. And then turn those other 12 or 13 tests into unit or integration tests. So one example I like to use for like what level of testing would be like let's say you're doing a user authentication story and you want to test that the user can reset their password to certain valid passwords or invalid passwords. So you might have a handful of passwords that are valid passwords, a handful of passwords that are invalid passwords. From an end-to-end perspective, it makes a whole lot of sense to have one test for user can reset to valid password, one test for user can't reset to an invalid password. But it doesn't make sense to have an end-to-end test for every possible bad password, every possible good password, right?
Yeah.
So when you're looking at that, you're using a little bit of art based on experience. The valid password versus invalid password, that logic belongs in a method somewhere, like a password validator object. And that should be unit tested.
Yeah.
And if my unit test is making sure valid and invalid logic is correct for passwords.
Mm-hmm.
And I have an integration test that makes sure that I'm using the password validator on that page.
Mm.
And then I have one end-to-end test that says it works when it's supposed to work, and another end-to-end test that says it doesn't work when it's not supposed to work.
Mm-hmm.
Like, to me, that's the essence of what the testing pyramid was supposed to be all about. Like, that's why you have 15 unit tests, 3 integration tests, and 2 end-to-end tests,
Mm-hmm.
is because the level of granularity is so much higher at the unit test level where it's fast and isolated,
Mm-hmm.
but you still need the top of the pyramid because that's what finally brings it all together.
Yeah. Yeah, I like that. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. And so when you're if you come into a project that doesn't have any automated testing in place,
Mm-hmm.
that can be a very healthy exercise. Is, let's list out all of our test scenarios,
Mm-hmm.
and then let's say, based on this scenario, what layer does that test belong in? Is it naturally a unit test? Is it naturally an end-to-end test?
Mm-hmm.
And then that can help you get a good balance when you bring it all together.
Yeah. Nice.
Yeah.
What place do you...
I've got another question for you.
Yeah.
What do you think is the best place to put the automated testing in the pipeline?
That's a great question. I remember you saying something that that shifted my thoughts on this a little bit. Because with Tugboat, what our application does is it builds a fully working preview of any in progress work, be that a commit or a branch or a pull request. So, if a developer is working on something, they and their peers can see it in action with all the data that's necessary in order to fully test it. And I remember at one point in I think it was a webinar that you and I were doing together, I was kind of pitching one of the values of that is that you can test everything all the time. And I remember you kind of shifting my mindset on that a little bit and saying you shouldn't really test everything all the time, because that, first of all, it just takes forever. So if you were trying to run through your full automated testing suite on every pull request, your CI bill would be huge, and it would take, depending on the size of your application, it might take several hours to get through that. And so yeah, I would say deciding. I definitely think unit tests, those usually run fast, and those are a great thing, I feel like, to just test on every pull request and just run through all of those.
Yeah, I'd like to clarify my position on that.
Yeah, good, because that's my memory of it, which maybe it may be a little skewed since that was several years ago, but
yeah. So my general philosophy is you should run as much as you possibly can before the pull request gets merged.
Yeah.
But experience has shown me that at some point you have to make compromises in that.
Yeah.
You have one of two options as you make those compromises. One of the options is to just not run certain tests at all. And in that case, you technically have lower test coverage than you otherwise would. And the other option is to decide that there is some subset of the tests that are okay to postpone. And so pre-merge, you're getting a really good idea that the post-merge testing is going to go well, but there's still some post-merge testing. And even places that are huge advocates of, we do pre-merge testing on our mono repo, we run test it everywhere. Big name companies that I guarantee you've heard of. Even some of them are like, oh yeah, but we still have a nightly regression run that does some other stuff like performance testing or load testing, right?
Right. Okay.
So there's usually some set of testing that happens
Mm-hmm.
pre-merge and some set that happens post-merge.
Yeah.
And my general recommendation is run as much as you can before the merge until you have a reason not to, and a really good reason not to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So that's probably kind of what I meant by that.
Yeah. Yeah. That makes sense.
And
I think that aligns with my understanding, and I probably just wasn't reflecting it well.
yeah,
Because if your full automated testing suite takes 2 minutes to run, then by all means run it on every pull request.
yeah. Yeah,
So,
and everybody's threshold is going to be different. And like,
yeah.
what are you building, right?
Yeah.
Are you building software that's going to go on a mission to Mars type rocket where if the
Yeah.
software doesn't work, a person's going to die? Like, I wouldn't mind having an hour for every PR merge if it meant somebody's not going to die.
Yeah. Absolutely.
You know, are you building like a consumer facing app that consumers don't pay for, and you have 10 million people using the app every single day, and you can effectively roll it out to 0.1% of your customer base, measure whether or not it's working, roll it back if it's not. If you're in that kind of situation, then maybe some tests are less important to run. And so I think the context is hugely important.
Yeah. Yeah. To extend the construction metaphor, building a house versus building a skyscraper, and anywhere in between, there's going to be different levels of rigor that are going to come to bear on those. And using skyscraper methodologies when you're building a house, it's just going to be a lot of wasted effort probably. But using house methodology when you're building a skyscraper, like someone's probably going to die.
Yeah. Yeah, and like that's the essence of engineering, right? Like that's why they call us engineers. Is it's our job to take a look at requirements, put those requirements in the context of our businesses, and propose software solutions that provide a good, cost-effective, reliable fit for those requirements in that context of our business.
Yeah.
And I'll give you a great example. B2C testing, I think, should be very different than B2B testing. A lot of B2B companies have fewer customers who are paying more money to use our software than B2C companies. And so if you're an accounting software platform and the CFO of the company that's your customer is running their annual reports, they only run that report once a year when they're trying to close the books on the end of the year. You can't tell that CFO who gives you $250,000 a year for your software, sorry, we broke that 6 months ago. We do A/B testing and nobody ran the report, so we just didn't know it was broken. We'll have it fixed in a few weeks.
Yeah, I know you changed your whole company strategy based on the results of this report that you printed out.
Yeah.
It was incorrect, but we're really sorry.
And so the stakes in software for B2B are typically higher because you're more likely to be, your user is more likely to be that decision maker who writes you a big check, who does things less frequently, but needs them to work. In the B2C environment, like take, Gmail, for example, or Netflix, their user base is so high and the actions those users are taking is so similar that it's very easy for them to instrument production and tell very quickly, is this code change a good code change or a bad code change? Like, how many people in Gmail do you think created a draft email in the last 5 minutes?
Yeah.
Like worldwide, all the users who are using Google, last 5 minutes.
Right.
And so the feedback you're going to get on something like that, if you just monitor production, is probably faster than the feedback you would get from running all the tests of everything you've got, right?
Yeah.
If you break something, you're going to hear about it in 5 minutes, even if it's only 0.1% of your user base. And so those are totally different scenarios for testing, and that's why I think a totally different testing approach makes sense.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. So I love the idea of how Tugboat does preview environments, and we've had some of our test street customers have used Tugboat very well together because they can run end-to-end tests against those preview environments prior to merging things. I'm assuming that a lot of the use case for people doing that is also to have manual testing happen in those environments. And I'm curious, what kind of benefits have you seen from being able to do both manual testing, which I'm including, product owners reviewing, did I get what I thought I was going to get as a form of manual testing? What benefits do you see from having that manual testing happen the same way the automated testing happens prior to the feature going into the main branch?
Yeah, I think I'm really curious about your thoughts on this too, about how manual testing kind of fits into an overall testing strategy. But a lot of the stakeholder sign off and design sign off and stuff like that, that's not a thing that you can necessarily write a user story around how many pixels should be between this button, or how it should feel, or those sorts of things. So some of the more subjective qualities about an application, having a human being able to actually touch it, feel it, what does it look like? How does it feel? What's it look like on all these different devices? Being able to hold your phone up and actually see the feature that you've been asking for before it actually goes out live. I think that to continue the construction metaphor, if you're getting your kitchen redone and you're just talking with the builder that's going to build it, and just having a conversation back and forth, and then suddenly you walk in and you see your kitchen and you're like, well, wait a minute, that's not what I meant. I didn't mean to to put the sink over there or whatever. I didn't like that color.
So if the carpet person shows up, you want to tell them it's the wrong carpet before they install it.
Yeah,
and while it's still on the truck, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I don't, I think that the earlier we catch those, the cost savings for the organization are exponential. So
yeah,
I would say that's the big value is yes, we can shift left all of the automated testing as much as we can. And if we can also shift left the actual stakeholder sign off and the manual QA part of things, we're going to save so much money for the organization.
Yeah. I mean, I was on a dev team that lived and breathed that philosophy. But the way that we had to do it, because this was, at this point, maybe 15 years ago or so, we would fire up screen sharing and just say, here's what I've got on my local machine. Does this look good enough before I push it out there? We were doing trunk-based development. So, once we pushed it out, it was on its way to production, fully automated on its way to production. And, so they started taking a look at what's on our machine. But, if they were in a meeting, we couldn't close out the work.
Right.
And now that we're in a more global world, a more remote world, people are working asynchronously. They're working in different time zones, different geographies. We're more respective of people's work-life balance. Now that all those things are in place, I think it's awesome that we have options to continue that practice of having product owners see things before they go into the main branch. But with preview environments, you don't have to do it synchronously. You can do it asynchronously. So I can push it out there, and then my coworker who's 4 time zones away when they start the day, they can pull up the preview environment and they can say, yeah, it looks good.
Yeah.
And then I can come in, later that day or another day and then merge that. And I think that's a really awesome and healthy practice.
Yeah. Because there's kind of like, let's imagine a team that works in like 2-week sprints. And if the current software delivery lifecycle is all the developers are working on their own machines, they're pushing up code, all the code's getting peer reviewed, it's going through the automated testing system, and then it gets merged in once everything looks green, right? Typically in that sort of a workflow, then you still have kind of all this body of work that might be multiple different work streams, all building towards the end of the sprint. Usually where there's this one demo, sprint demo, where all the stakeholders show up. You got the Friday afternoon meeting, and all the big wigs are on the call. And we go to, the project manager goes to kick off the demo, and they pull up the application and it's a white screen of death. And
yeah,
we call that the dumpster fire demo day. Everybody, just morale for the entire team is just like, just tanks.
Yeah,
right?
You work so hard to get an
Yeah, exactly. So, and not to mention, like, let's say even everything works fine, but you have that one, let's say we go through the demo and you have that one thing, it's like the stakeholders just not happy about. How do you untangle that one bit from all the other bits that have now been merged in?
Yeah.
We've been dealing with merge conflicts all through the week, maybe in order to get all of our packages in sync with one another. And now, oops, we got to roll this one back. Otherwise, we blocked the entire release for a week or 2 weeks or something like that. So just the ability for an organization to be so much more nimble and to catch things before they block all these other work streams, with being able to, and also to distribute the load of QA and stakeholder sign off throughout the entire sprint. Instead of it all kind of like building, you've got all this work that's going in, and then it's crunch time. All the stakeholders need to sign off today, otherwise this release isn't going out. And what ends up happening there is that the stakeholders don't have time on a Friday to do it, and so they just say, just ship it, and then it goes out and it's not good, right? So then it's like it's actually in production. And we've found out, well, we lost, $150,000 in revenue today because on the mobile viewport, one of the important ads that we were trying to launch with this didn't actually go out, or something like that,
Yeah.
So stuff like that. It's just really, really impactful for an organization.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for coming on the episode, James.
Yeah, absolutely. This was a lot of fun.
Yeah, once again, we've been talking to Jane Sansbury, who is the Director of Product for Tugboat QA, the company that does these preview environments that we've been talking about. So if you haven't checked out that practice, it's one that I'd recommend you all consider, because it can definitely improve quality in your organization. So thanks for coming on the program, James. I hope you have a good day.
Yeah, thanks for having me.